what Mamdani's candidacy shows as an individual who is not willing to call for the complete disarming of Hamas inside the Gaza Strip is not only do you evade punishment if you deal in Jew hatred, but you may actually be rewarded by becoming the mayor of New York City. The Israel Defense Forces has hit back hard. They've targeted approximately 150 different targets. But I have to say, in my opinion, it is not enough. If it's been discovered that there's released prisoners, that they are already returning to the work of terror planning, Israel should be considering eliminating them. It's utter depravity. It's cynicism of the worst possible kind. It shows everyone that, as though we didn't already know it, this terror organization is not, cannot ever be for the trusting. Hi, folks. Thank you very much for tuning in to this episode of the MirYam Institute Situational Briefing. I really appreciate you doing so. And if you haven't done so already, I want to appeal to you to please hit the like and subscribe button at our channel so that you'll receive all of our latest updates. You'll be able to view all of our cutting edge footage, and doing so really does help us to reach an ever wider audience. And I thank you in advance of your time for your partnership on that front. I also want to remind you to please let us know what's on your mind. You can leave a comment and a question in the comment section below, and we will do our very best to get to that. So thank you very much. Subscribe today. And with that, it's on with the show. The emergence of Zohran Mamdani as the leading candidate for mayor of New York City ought to be ringing alarm bells for not just the Jews of New York, but the Jewish community throughout the United States of America, the largest diaspora community in the world, incidentally. And it should also be ringing alarm bells for Jewish people in other countries and for the state of Israel. Now, I could sit here and talk about the fact that this individual has risen to such prominence and to such a lead in the polls. Of course, everything will be decided on election day, and I don't want to foreclose the outcome of that election, but he seems to be the front leader, and I could criticize the fact that American Jewry saw his emergence and in Manhattan, in New York, essentially has proven completely ineffective at finding, unearthing, uncovering, and propelling forward a potent candidate to preserve the very positive Jewish life that has been the state of play to this point in New York. That's a conversation that I believe the New York Jewish community should be having within itself at this time. I can understand them perhaps not seeing Mamdani when he first emerged, but once he became as prominent as he is, there ought to have been some sort of organized political response to that, and that has not been the case. But there's something else at play here. You know, a lot of people fail to see that there's a mirroring of the aftermath of October the 7th, and there's also a mirroring in terms of the inability of Israel to anticipate the threats coming towards it, and the inability of diaspora Jewry to anticipate the threats that were coming towards them. So in Israel, obviously, we failed to understand what was coming towards us from across the border inside the Gaza Strip on that dreadful, dreadful day. In American Jewry, there was a complete lack of awareness about what was coming towards it from the campuses, from the media, from social media, and quite frankly, from throughout far too many communities across the United States of America. Now, the distinction between the two is that once we had paid the dreadful price of that day, we in Israel were able to arm up, rally our troops, and go and push back against the enemy. Diaspora Jewry has failed to demonstrate that it can do so, and the Mamdani candidacy and his leadership is emblematic of that reality. Now, a lot of people may wonder, why is it that on October the 7th, Jew hatred came unmasked in the United States of America? Now, my own theory there is that Jew hatred had always been latent. I was lecturing on university campuses filled with haters of Israel and haters of the Jewish people as far back as 2007, incidentally. I knew about this phenomenon, but it was always latent. It came en masse after October the 7th because the anti-Semites in the United States of America looked on at the massacre against Israel and Israelis, and they reasoned if the Jewish state is vulnerable and perhaps there for the taking, perhaps the Jewish community here in the United States is equally vulnerable. Perhaps this is our moment. Perhaps now is the time for us to launch our most potent attack against it. That's problematic in and of itself, but what really ought to be disturbing to everybody is not that the anti-Semites have now uncovered themselves and shown themselves to us. What's much more concerning is that they have learned, as a consequence of their anti-Semitic actions largely going without any real punishment, is that they can wield their Jew hatred and they will face absolutely no penalty. And what Mamdani's candidacy shows, as an individual who is not willing to resile from his idea that the Intifada should be globalized, as an individual who is not willing to call for the complete disarming of Hamas inside the Gaza Strip, but incidentally is a real campaigner for gun control in New York City, what they should learn from this, observers, is not only do you evade punishment if you deal in Jew hatred, but you may actually be rewarded by becoming the mayor of New York City. And that is a terrible new normal for everybody to be looking at, perhaps stepping into. It's of high concern. And I think that the American Jewish establishment really, really does need to look inward and see how it prevents any such situation coming about again, incidentally, regardless of whether Mamdani is ultimately victorious or not. As you may or may not know, there have been a number of attacks launched by Hamas terrorists against members of the Israel Defense Forces. One of those attacks, incidentally, has resulted in the killing of an IDF reservist, a 37-year-old reservist, father of four, named Master Sergeant Yona Ephraim Feldbaum. Now, he was killed by sniper fire in an incident that involved sniper fire on IDF troops, plus the use of RPGs. And that wasn't the only incident. The day prior to that, there were attacks on the heavy machinery being used by the Israel Defense Forces. And both of these took place in the area of Rafah or Rafiah, which is the crossing between southern Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula, that really is a source of oxygen for Hamas inside the Gaza Strip. It's across that line that we've seen so much contraband and so much terror training come into the Gaza Strip, all of which resulted in the attack of October the 7th, 2023. Now, with all of that in mind, people need to be aware of the fact that these are absolutely typical guerrilla terror tactics. So this is not currently Hamas able to operate as a terror army, which is what it was prior to October 7th, as designated by the Israel Defense Forces. It's now a guerrilla terror organization capable of launching attacks, specifically when one considers the fact that the IDF is largely in a static position, not completely, but largely in a static position. As I've said before to you, a military needs to be on the move. It either moves forward or it moves backward, but it should not be static. Being static makes it ripe for attack, and we're seeing those attacks take place. So in terms of Hamas's motivation here, I believe that it's quite straightforward, actually. We have a president of the United States, President Donald J. Trump, who came to Israel to really wax lyrical about the victory of the ceasefire agreement, the peace deal, as he called it, that he had brokered between Israel and Hamas. He was then swiftly followed by the senior-most members of his administration and his senior-most advisors, both in official and non-official capacities, which makes these individuals some of the most important individuals in the world. And I'm referring to his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, his special envoy, Steve Witkoff. Then we saw Vice President J.D. Vance come to the area, and he was followed by Secretary of State Marco Rubio. And all of that, if taken on face value, should lead us to believe that at the very least, the American administration does not want the current ceasefire arrangement to fall apart. it has put enormous resources, enormous political capital into brokering that, and has announced it, as I said, as a great victory for peace. Now, with that in mind, one can understand what Hamas is doing. What Hamas is doing is really trying to test the limits of Israel's willingness to preserve the ceasefire that its major ally, the United States, wants to hold. And Hamas is testing those limits by acting in ways that show that it's actually not interested in peace, by acting in ways that show that it's going to continue to fight against the state of Israel. It's going to continue to act upon its ideology, upon its mission statement, upon its charter, and it is going to continue to seek the death of IDF soldiers. And the other thing that's very important about the stage at which we find ourselves is there is a desire by the Americans to move on to phase 2 of this ceasefire deal. Now, you will remember that the deal as originally presented was supposed to be a single deal, 20 points in nature, and all of those points were to be acceded to by both parties. It was then promptly split into two. Phase 1, the return of the 20 hostages, living hostages to Israel, and of course, a withdrawal of the IDF to what is referred to as the Yellow Line. Phase 2 calls for the dismantling of Hamas as a terror organization and for it to hand over its weapons. They are not going to do that. That's why I always viewed the splitting of any deal as extremely, extremely problematic. What is the sole currency that Hamas holds, or the most potent currency that Hamas holds, in order to avoid it having to dismantle its network and its arms? The retention of the 13 deceased hostages. So they gave away the 20 living hostages. That gave them the ability to live to fight another day. The day is today. That's why we're seeing these attacks against the members of the IDF. The Israel Defense Forces has hit back hard. They've targeted approximately 150 different targets. They've done so primarily from the air, although the Nachal Brigade is undertaking a great many raids on Hamas infrastructure right now beyond the Yellow Line, in other words, beyond the perimeter to which the IDF had withdrawn, so that we can move forward and really break down the threats that are coming from that area. But I have to say, in my opinion, it is not enough. I'm concerned that there is a return to the pre-October 7th reality, whereby Hamas would launch attacks against members of the IDF, or more often Israeli civilians, by way of rocket fire, and the IDF would then go forward and detonate a series of targets, destroy a series of targets, that none of those targets would bring Hamas to heel. They were, I wouldn't say ceremonial, but they were not conclusive in terms of the effect that they had. When you have 150 targets being fired upon by the Israel Defense Force, that's very, very positive. Of course, we should be very aggressive in our response to these attacks upon our troops. But I would like to see some further reaching responses by Israel. And I'll give you one example of those. We ought to, given that Hamas is in breach of its agreement for the ceasefire, we should be saying, if that's good enough for you, it's good enough for us. We are now going to go and round up the Palestinian Arabs that we released from our prisons as part of this ceasefire deal. They will now be detained. They will be taken back into the prisons. And incidentally, if it's been discovered, as is very possible, that there's released prisoners, many of whom are terrorists with blood on their hands, that they are already returning to the work of terror planning and terror organization, then in my view, they should not merely be rounded up and taken back to prison, but Israel should be considering eliminating them in response to Hamas targeting our troops. There is video footage that has been shared with the Americans that was captured by Israeli satellite observations, and it shows Hamas terrorists taking a sack, essentially, a body bag, filled with the remains of a hostage who was kidnapped from the Nova Festival on October the 7th and was then killed inside the Gaza Strip. That hostage's name is Ofer Serfati. and Ofer Tzirfati was returned to Israel for burial. His family, in other words, have already carried out a funeral over his remains. But it turns out that not the entirety of his remains were buried. There are still some of his remains inside the Gaza Strip. And it's those remains that Hamas took out of a building. They then placed it in an enormous pit that they had dug with some of the heavy equipment that they're being allowed to use, falsely, incidentally, based on the idea that they require that equipment in order to search for the remaining deceased hostages, which is a complete lie. One does not look for the remains of hostages, deceased hostages, using heavy machinery of that type. Rather, they're using it, as I'll explain in a moment, to dig up and to find their weapons caches throughout the Gaza Strip where they're able to do so. But in any event, to come back to this scenario, they took the remains of Ofer Tzirfati, they put them into a white body bag, they dumped that white body bag into a pit that they had dug, and they then covered that white body bag, and this is all on camera, they then covered that white body bag in sand and in soil, and then they called the Red Cross to witness their recovery of one of the 13 deceased hostages that they are supposed to be returning. Okay, so not even to witness the return of the final remains of Ofer Tzirfati, but rather of one of the 13 other hostages that they're supposed to be returning to us. They called the Red Cross and they showed them that they had just magically discovered the body of another hostage. And it's utter depravity. It's cynicism of the worst possible kind. It shows everyone that, as though we didn't already know it, this terror organization is not, cannot ever be for the trusting. And it also, to me, shows the naivete and foolishness, I don't want to believe, the complicity of the Red Cross inside the Gaza Strip. So horrific footage, and it's worth mentioning what Ofer Tzirfati's mother said when she was presented with the fact that she had to, again, unearth his grave and place these additional remains within that grave so that his body could be buried in whole rather than in part. And she said to the media in Israel, and I'm quoting here, she questioned, how can one bury their son in these increments? How can one survive the fact that time after time we are required to do this? All of you should know that every time we reopen his grave, my heart is reopened and another small part of me is buried within the grave alongside him. So the psychological torment and horror that Hamas is carrying out is really beyond my abilities to describe. And I'll just add another aspect to all of this with regard to where Hamas is operating and the work that it requires from the Red Cross in order to enable it to do so. So the IDF has given Hamas the permit to come beyond the yellow line, in other words, into the IDF-held segment of the yellow line, and to start the searching for the remaining deceased hostages there under the supervision of the Red Cross. And it has come to light within the Israel Defense Forces that the Hamas operatives, terrorists, are not actually doing the searching for bodies. As I mentioned, what they're doing there is they're actually seeking the weapons caches that are buried by them, incidentally, throughout the Gaza Strip. So that's going to show another aspect of the ineptitude and the lack of seriousness that we can attach at times to the mission of the Red Cross. They're not suitable supervisors, and it's a very, very complex situation. So the idea that an international stabilization force is somehow going to be deployed throughout the Gaza Strip and will be capable and able to dismantle their weapons infrastructure and to compel Hamas to disarm, to me, is completely, totally and utterly absurd, to the point where I don't think it really warrants legitimate or serious discourse or conversation. I'm a combat veteran of the Israel Defense Forces. The first war in which I served was the Second Lebanon War in 2006. There were international forces that were arrayed along Israel's northern border with southern Lebanon. And those forces, though they had a specific mandate, which was to be a peacekeeping force, they obviously, as is evinced by the fact the Second Lebanon War broke out when it did, they obviously were absolutely unable to adhere to their own mission statement, namely to actually keep the peace. When soldiers go to war, when soldiers go to a combat zone, they go to that combat zone and they win because wars are won by way of the question of who wants it the most. They're not actually, despite conventional wisdom, ultimately won by who has the qualitative military edge, the QME, which is a phrase that's bandied about the states of Israel very, very often these days. Wars are not won by that. Wars are not won by hiring soldiers who are professional soldiers with no ideology very often attached to the carrying out of the orders that they receive from other countries and dispatching them to far-flung theatres of war. They're won by soldiers who are invested and who want the positive outcome for the sake of their country, their families, their communities, their societies. The only military that checks all of those boxes when it comes to operating in the Gaza Strip on behalf of the State of Israel, surprise, surprise, is the military of the State of Israel, the one and only Israel Defense Forces. And so ultimately, if we are to see the dismantling of Hamas as a terror organization, and if we are to see them part ways with their weapons, it's going to be the military pressure that the IDF applies in order for that to be brought about. It will not be the result of an international force. And incidentally, there are too many elements within this so-called international force that we don't want anywhere near our operations inside the Gaza Strip. To mention just two of those elements, the first would be the Qataris, and the second would be the Turks. Two extremely problematic, bad actors. The notion that they would be engaged in anything that is to the benefit of the states of Israel is completely flawed. And I would encourage all of you to completely and utterly reject that notion on its face. It's nonsense.